welcome to the Learning Experience powered by CAST. I'm one of your hosts, Kelli Suding.
And I'm Luis Perez.
And I'm Brian Dean.
We are three educators here ready to break down barriers until learning has no limits. Let's do this. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Learning Experience. We love having you join us each month. I'm with my friend and colleague, Luis, and we're going to be your host today. How's it going, Luis?
Hey, it's going pretty well, Kelli.
So, Luis, we've been talking about having this conversation for quite some time. The day is finally here. And it really worked out well because I heard from a student recently, just last week actually, and he was trying to access some information that he needed, but the text wasn't available in the format that he could use because he uses assistive technology. And so ultimately what happened was he spent hours trying to visually decode the text, and just that cognitive load in itself within that task, he was completely exhausted. And I'm thinking to myself, as a student is having a conversation with me, that if it had been designed accessibly from the start, he could have been right there learning at the same time as his peers and not be as exhausted. So my question to you today, have you or do you still experience anything like that similar? And what's your approach like? What do you do?
Oh my goodness, what a good question. How long is this podcast?
Yeah. I know, right?
No, I do still experience that. I will share an experience, when we think about higher education, which is where I do a lot of my work. Mm-hmm. Not everybody knows this, but I actually did 2 PhD programs. And I completed all the coursework in one and then made a very dramatic life decision to abandon that program and join a different one. And the main reason why I joined that other program is because I had become so frustrated with the first one.
Wow.
And just kind of facing these barriers, right, of inaccessible content, inaccessible tools. But then when I shifted to the other program, which, by the way, was special education. And so they knew about a framework called Universal Design for Learning. Yeah. And that's really what allowed me to finish that program and to succeed. But I was spending so much energy in my first program of just trying to change the information into the formats that I needed or waiting, right? So waiting for somebody in the disability services office to take my book and scan it. And that just is not right, that I am now at a disadvantage, that I have to wait or expend extra effort. Where my attention should be on my studies, right? And being able to do what I want to do to be able to be successful. But today I would say that PDFs are still a challenge. Yeah. Even when they're fully accessible, because I do a lot of my reading on mobile devices. Yeah. And I still face some challenges in terms of the usability of PDFs. So I've become a big advocate for EPUB. Yeah. And for web formats, right? So whenever I can, I try to advocate for people procuring their textbooks or whatever content they need in a web-based format where your assistive technology is going to work wonderfully. Yeah. Not that PDF can't be made accessible, but again, there's some limitations there. And so I really love EPUB and try to advocate for it. And I use a service called Bookshare, which we plugged a number of times on this podcast. And that allows me to get my content in EPUB. And by the way, you can suggest books to Bookshare if they don't have them in their collection. That's something that I do all the time. I try to recommend books for them to acquire and make available to others. So that's my approach.
That's definitely a valuable tool. So for our listeners who don't really, maybe EPUB is the first time they've heard of that term. Can you explain a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, it's basically a container for a number of web technologies. So if you were to open up an EPUB file, you would find that it's just a collection of web pages with some additional navigation, additional structures, right, that you need to present it to a e-reader, right, a reading system. And so it was built with accessibility in mind from the start, and uses a lot of these robust web technologies that really compatible with our assistive technologies. And so the main advantage of it is that when you open it on a mobile device, it reflows, right? so that as I resize the text, it kind of reflows to fit that small screen, which means that as a person with low vision, I don't have to scan around as much. So it's
Yeah.
just a much more flexible format to me.
Yeah, which many people are using their mobile devices, right, to having access to the information. And so here you are, your second PhD program, and you leave it because it's inaccessible. So when we dive into accessibility, it's not just about compliance, it's about opportunity, right? So when we leave it out, we're not thinking about accessibility. We're not just making things harder, but we are actually leaving people behind, just like the student I talked about, just like your program. Which brings us to our guest, David Berman. And he has been a leader in showing how accessibility can and should be woven into everything that we do. So, David, welcome. We're so glad to have you here with us.
Hey, Kelly, thanks for having me. It's so good to be with Cast again.
And I'll just add one of the things that I really love about working with David. I love when people are not just technically proficient, but they are also very human centered.
Yeah.
And very compassionate, and just out to make the world a better place. So I love the title of David's book, "Do Good Design," and with an emphasis on the word "good." Right. So not only can you be a great designer, but you can also make a difference in the world. And so I've really enjoyed working with you, David, over the short time that we've known each other because of your approach to accessibility, which I think is unique.
Lo mismo, Luis. I've learned so much working with Cast, with you, Luis, with over 3 dozen people that I've worked with over the years. I remember the time when I first learned about Cast. It was because, of course, Cast is instrumental in the development of UDL, Universal Design for Learning. And there was a time in my career when I was just starting out. I was like, oh my gosh, these people are gods. Look what they created. Someday I'll connect with these people or I'd see something like on WGBH Boston on PBS. I say, wow, these people are doing remarkable things. I want to do things like that. And so when I first got a message from Cast saying that I actually could have a small part in what Cast has created, I was quelling.
I definitely would not say it was a small part, David, right? You have a big influence on just the accessibility that we do within our own organization as well. And I have to say, I've not been as privileged as Louise to know you for so long. And this is the first time we've met. And I would love to hear more about you, your accessibility journey, what brought you into the work, all the things that we can learn about you.
I'm remembering that I was on stage at a design conference because I've worked with, as Luis knows well, I've worked with governments and NGOs and companies on 5 continents, helping them make their websites, their documents, their apps more accessible. My roots were in graphic design, and there was a time I was just obsessed with typography. I was obsessed with the black and white newspaper world. I was obsessed with the black and white world because I actually had a substantial color deficit. And as I was discovering the idea of being a graphic designer, I was also terrified that someone would discover that I didn't see color the way most people did, and I was going to get outed. And it wasn't until I was traveling the world, I was speaking at all these amazing design conferences, and there was one in Korea, in Seoul, Korea, and the theme was they wanted us to talk about color. That was the theme of the entire conference. And I was supposed to be one of the keynote speakers. I said, what am I going to talk about? And so I stood up and I decided to talk about designing without color. And then I explained, because as a graphic designer who's colorblind, and I kind of just let it out. I thought, this is my big moment to just see what happens. And it's easy to think about in retrospect that it wasn't a big deal at all. People were fascinated. And they were fascinated with the idea of how we make sure we communicate on all channels, which of course is a key to UDL. It's that, people learn different ways, they communicate in different ways, they store knowledge in different ways. And so, of course, one of the fundamentals of universal design is to share knowledge in multiple channels to make sure everyone gets saturated. It gets at least one channel, and most brains, of course, enjoy getting the double dip of getting the information through multiple channels, and so things are, I can preach into the converted here. But the point was, I made this whole talk about designing without relying on color. And people were fascinated, and they were fascinated in my perspective and how I saw color differently. So, long answer to a short question is that's what led me into inclusive design, universal design, becoming the showcase of the type of social responsible work that I was touring the planet talking about, which is what the book was about. So at the same time, I was just so fortunate that there was a rise in regulations and legislation, really born in America, a really wonderful made in America story where the ADA, it was arguably one of the greatest pieces of human rights legislation in the history of civilization. And so we're looking at the early 90s when America leads the world and making it the law to make things accessible. And then that lit a fire in Ontario, where I live, in Ottawa, Canada, where I live, the federal government, and Canada then leapfrogged the United States in some ways, making it against the law for the federal government to publish material that didn't conform to standards. And so what used to be what we call a Robin Hood kind of arrangement, where in our design firm, there's some clients would pay full fee, and others you'd do things for free, you'd steal from the rich and give to the poor. Suddenly, all these big organizations suddenly needed what we knew how to do already, inclusive design. And it very much became the focus of our work. And now I'd say 95% plus of the work we do is all around making sure that no one gets left behind, specifically online.
Yeah, I love that you shared that story and how you didn't want to be outed, but yet I also have this sense of that you were completely empowered by sharing that story. And I'm so grateful that you're sharing that with our learners, because a lot of people with disabilities, and they're not seen, right? We can't see the disability, or they're unidentified. They do the same things, right? They're looking like trying to get cues or trying to blend in. And so just thanks. I just want to be intentional. Thank you for sharing that story.
Well, Kelly, thanks. You're so spot on, because before I outed myself, I thought that I had a deficit in terms of what I could see. And I was always compensating and sometimes making things up, frankly.
Yeah.
But then when I realized it's not that I don't see color, it's I see it differently. And I recognized that the way I see color was actually useful to the broader population. So that switched in my own mind by sharing my situation with others, and I didn't expect it.
Yeah, we often say, like with universal design for learning, it's really not a deficit focus, but more of an asset-based pedagogy, because we look at the things that people are able to do, right? And the strengths that they bring to the learning experience. So I really appreciate you sharing that, David. You've had such a big impact on me with some of the things that I learned from you in our trainings that we did together for CAST. But one thing stood out to me, one quote from one of your presentations, when you said, and I think this quote is so appropriate for the times that we're living in, because it can be really challenging to do accessibility work right now. But this is a quote that I hang on to, and of course I credit you fully. And one time you said, "We have the power to include everyone." And I just think that's such a powerful quote. Can you expand on that, what you meant by that? Because I think it would be really insightful for people.
Well, thank you,
At this
Luis. I'm
time.
glad I made an impact. Certainly, the way I see it is this. There have been perhaps 7,500 generations of humans. And yet, only in the last 3 decades have we actually had the technology that makes it possible to include everyone in communications. So, Kelly, you were talking before about the challenge of the textbook. And if you take it back 100 years, well, it was really been difficult to have an inclusive alternative or a universally accessible textbook. But in the last 3 decades, IT, including the internet, creating the reach, has made it truly possible for us to liberate us all from these constraints. In fact, I can argue that more people have been liberated in the last 35 years through accessible information technology than all the wars in the history of humanity. So if I just happen to be lucky enough to be born, whether it's fate or it's luck, if we happen to be born in that 7,500th generation, where it's truly possible for us to include everyone for the first time, then I feel it's our social responsibility as professional communicators to get that done.
I
I
love
wish we
that.
could send heart emojis through the podcast because I would have them flying all over the place.
And I typically, I've often said in presentations before, like, this is the best time in history to have a disability. And kind of mirrors your sentiment, David. We have not only technology, but you started by mentioning the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? And we have the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So we have these frameworks in place as well. And then also a greater awareness from just seeing people with disabilities out in the world in ways that we didn't before, right? So we see people with disabilities who are out and proud in our workplaces, in our schools, in our universities. And that has a big impact, right? To see these role models. So I really appreciate that positive spin on accessibility because it does keep me going to think about. I have great power and great responsibility as well. Like Spider-Man, I think. Is that the right comic book? I don't
That's
know.
right. That's right.
So, speaking of great power and great responsibility, another big concept, right, from the training that we did together is this idea that we can design without trade-offs, right, when it comes to accessibility. So, can you tell us a little bit more about that? How do we do that? How do we design without trade-offs?
Yeah, I think that the idea of design without trade-offs goes to the heart of universal design because we all have great examples we can pull out of, let's say, a ramp that's built in front of a residence to help someone, let's say in a wheelchair, be able to enter the residence, but it's done in such a way that it's in the way of snow removal, or it's in the way of grocery delivery, or it just looks god awful because it wasn't thought through carefully. And so there's potential pushback where people could frame something, say, "Oh, accommodating people with disabilities, what a hassle it is! It's really expensive, and it's not pretty, and it's in the way of everyone's rah 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 rah." And of course, those things could be true if you went out of your way to make it that way. But when we design for accessibility with the trade-offs, it means we make alternatives or even make changes to the main way of getting something done that either is neutral to the quote unquote typical users, that's neutral to the majority of users, or actually enhances the experience of all users. And with very few exceptions, especially in our digital accessibility work, it's so rare that we cannot find a way to overcome a hurdle in a way that either enhances the UX for all, or at least has no effect at all. You wouldn't even know that thing's there unless you were a screen reader user. It was like, oh my gosh, I can actually use this textbook. So Kelly, to go back to the textbook example, and I want to kudos to the Department of Justice and the other organizations in Canada and Europe who have, just in the last few years, really pinned down what they expect textbooks to be like. So from a regulatory perspective, so you can have a textbook, whether it's in PDF or EPUB format or other electronic formats, that to the typical user, they wouldn't even know anything changed. But in the invisible layers of how that document is structured, it means that they magnify easily for someone who has low vision, or they translate easily for someone who has a tool that will take those words and convert them into a language or even just a dialect from doctor to patient language, let's say. And that all becomes possible with AI, a truly personalized individual stream of knowledge coming at you that's been based on the corpus of every email you've written in the last 10 years. That kind of thing is now possible and happening. So back to the textbook then, we can make changes to how the textbook is in a way that the typical user wouldn't notice any change at all, and yet opens the document up for assistive technologies to allow people to learn that information and transfer that knowledge and record that knowledge in ways that they simply couldn't do before. And so that's all about accessibility without trade-offs. And that includes economic trade-offs.
Oh,
because
sure.
we can also demonstrate that the what I like to call the accessibility dividend, the return on the investment, we can demonstrate that. We've got case studies where $1 million was invested in making it possible for, let's say, the tax department to help people file their taxes themselves online, and it drove down the cost of telephone support in that same department by $25 million. And so these are ways we make things more accessible for the extreme cases. We do them in a way where all users potentially benefit, and we actually drive down costs. We make things easier to do, and we let people focus more on strategic tasks rather than on reactive tasks of helping or assisting people get through stuff that they'd rather do independently.
Yeah, I really like how you describe that. And you made me think of this video that I think Louise may have shared with me, but it's this video about if the world was designed by individuals with disabilities. And it shows, like, say, me as a visual reader going into a library and everything is in Braille. All of a sudden, I quickly see how inaccessible it is. And I just really loved how you described accessibility, like built in where you don't really know, but if it's inaccessible, we quickly know. And we've come to this space where, we get excited if, someone's using a screen reader and they're almost surprised that it works, right? And so making that shift, which leads us to some changes that are coming up within the US next year. So, and you've been talking about digital accessibility. And so next year, there's going to be a really important accessibility here, right? With the updated Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, Title II rule. It's going into effect for many of the school districts and institutions that we personally work with. So with that said, I would love to hear your summarization of that rule and give us your take on it. Why do you think it's important, and what can leaders do to start getting ready for it?
Oh, sure, Kelly. Happy to do that. I'm really glad you've pinpointed that, because it really is something that's driving real change on a deadline. Regulations have that benefit because, we have all sorts of aspirations of how we can continue to design a better civilization together. And things are getting better, but they're not getting better fast enough, especially if you're living in it. But the remarkable thing that happened was see, when the ADA, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was published back in the turn of the 1990, 1991, ironically, there was no public internet yet. And so there's nothing in the act itself that talks about what about online. And so then over the years, there's been a lot of steps towards developing standards. And even going back to 2013, the Department of Justice started making noises about potentially publishing some clarity, because what was going on in America was someone would say, okay, well, I can buy that thing in Walmart in person, but how about the Walmart website, which is maybe the only way I can buy it now? In the early days of the internet was an add-on. But now, especially if you're a person living with a substantial disability, the internet's kind of a double-edged sword, because it's so good that a lot of things you used to be able to do in person, or you used to be able to do the old way, quote unquote, now there's only one way to do it. And so although internet accessibility has become better and better, if we're in a society where there's only certain ways you can get things done and you have to do them on the internet, then now that digital accessibility isn't just a nice to have. So going back over 10 years, the Department of Justice was playing with the idea of actually coming clear with, okay, what actually is the interpretation of the ADA for online experiences? And they got noodled around for years, but finally, in 2024, the Department of Justice passed what's called a final rule, which doesn't mean it's the last rule there'll ever be. What it means, it's kind of like, it makes sense to lawyers. But so the ADA Title II final rule, I'm going to just unpack. Should I unpack that for us?
Please.
Would that be helpful?
Yes.
Okay. So the ADA has 4 titles, like big chunks of this document. And it's organized by who is obligated So Title I is about obligations of federal government organizations and agencies and things funded by them. That's Title I. Title II is the group of obligated organizations that are publicly funded at the state or municipal level. So, for example, a public university or college is funded at the state level, or a community college funded at the municipal level. That's a Title II organization. Title III is about private sector organizations. So that's you're private if you're Harvard, you're private if you're Walmart. And then Title IV is specifically about communications. So we'll put that one aside. So the thing is that the ADA is now backed by a rule that was made for Title II organizations. It was in draft form for a long time. And then finally, when it became a final rule, it meant it's published as this is a real rule. We're done finalizing this rule. And this rule was about pinning down how you'd measure digital accessibility for those Title II organizations. And when we're talking about education, that's mostly we're talking about then about colleges, universities, schools that are all funded at the state level or the municipal level. So essentially at its core, the Title II final rule, this regulation published by the Department of Justice, says that by a certain date, everything published and used in these organizations needs to conform to an international standard called WCAG, WCAG. This is the global measuring stick for digital accessibility. WCAG, or the cool kids call it WCAG, because that's what the JAWS screen reader calls it, WCAG.
You hear that, everybody? So, if you want to be one of the cool kids, WCAG.
Yeah, if you're sitting in the back of the bus, you're yelling, you're going, WCAG, right? So, but WCAG is fine as well. Just don't say WCAG. If you say WCAG, people know you're a poser, okay? So in the captioning, I'll make that clear. WCAG versus WCAG. Okay, so WCAG has different levels, and there's been different versions of it published. So not only did the DOJ say you need to conform to WCAG, they said you need to conform to WCAG version 2.1, which is the most popular version of WCAG on Earth right now. There is a WCAG 2.2 already. I'll circle back to that, Luis, if you don't mind, when we start talking about Europe, maybe, if we have time.
Yes, absolutely.
But right now in America, except for a couple of states and municipalities, everyone's pretty well settled on WCAG 2.1 rather than 2.2. Double A, that's the level of WCAG. WCAG has 3 levels, A, AA, and AAA. And as long as you follow all the level A rules and the AA rules, of which there are 50 in total, if you follow all 50 rules for your textbook or your website or your PowerPoint you're giving in a classroom, then you can say the entire thing, that textbook, that EPUB, that PDF, that Word file, that PowerPoint, that web form, you can say it conforms to WCAG 2.1 AA. And the DOJ gave us 2 years. They gave us lots of advance warning, but when they actually published that final rule, they gave us 2 years to fulfill the obligations for most schools of a certain size. So there's 2 deadlines. April 24th next year, 2026, that's the deadline for most Title II organizations to conform to WCAG 2.1 AA. Now, if you're funded by a smaller population, like a district that's 50,000 people or less, then you get an extra year. So if it's, let's say, a community college in a small town, then you have till April 26, 2027. But for the most part, almost all the clients we're working with and the publishers we're working with, suddenly this April 24th, 2026 deadline has really lit a match under the foot of some aspects of them. Like many of these publishers already were doing great things for other reasons. But this made it clear that, hey, all these learning materials that are used in the classroom need to conform. It's not just textbooks. And there's lots of nuance. Like we could do a whole podcast just on the exceptions and exclusions in these rules and where you can provide things in different formats and stuff. But when we're talking about textbooks, we're talking about the core stuff that's used for the learning experience in the classroom, they're the things that Title II Final Rule is admirably toughest about.
Yeah, and you mentioned Europe. So I think while we're going in hot here, can you just explain what is going on with Europe and the accessibility, and why should we pay attention to that as well? And I also feel like the urgency of the dates, right? We should have started yesterday. It feels like yesterday we needed to start.
But it's not too late, right?
Not too late.
The important thing is to have a plan in place, right? To bring together a team of people at your organization. And it's not going to be one person that can do this, right? So we emphasize at CAS, bring together a cross-sectional team of people at your organization that can work on this, and then come up with a plan. Because as that deadline gets closer, right, you do need to show progress, at least that you are, making a commitment and that you have steps in place. So we really encourage you to get started yesterday. But if you didn't get started yesterday, today is a good day to start.
That's right.
Well, you're absolutely right. And it may seem very daunting, and it can get very nerdy. But to divide and conquer this challenge, the wind is at your back, because unlike some other areas of how civilization has organized itself, digital accessibility standards are remarkably well harmonized globally. So it's not like you've got imperial measurements in one country and metric in another. And it's not like, completely understandably, up here in Canada, we have very different built environment standards, because just things freeze more here than in Florida. So there's a need for things like electrical standards and how thick is your concrete kind of standards. They really need to be different regionally. However, the digital standards for accessibility, by intention, have evolved due to remarkable work over the last 20 years of people in the United States and Europe and Australia and Canada working together to develop standards that are very much the same when we cross borders. And I'm saying this, Kelli, to reach back to what you mentioned, because about what's going on in Europe. So just like America passed laws specific to the federal government, Section 508, for example, over a decade ago, just like Canada passed laws specific to the federal government back in 1999, it took a while for regulations to come around that affected everyone else, the companies, the NGOs, the educational institutions. And it's the same in Europe. There's been remarkable regulations governing what government must do, but it was only in the last few years that something called the European Accessibility Act really settled in. And it was passed in 2019, but the idea was that all the member states of the EU agreed that they would have regulations very similar to the Title II Final Rule in place for all the organizations of a certain size across Europe. And in fact, the UK was still part of the EU then. So this is pre-Brexit decision, so even though the UK left the EU, still they had already committed to this harmonized plan. And they're one of the leaders. So the deadline, just like I said, the deadline for Title II, the final rule is the first deadline is in 2026. The EAA, the European Accessibility Act, calls for conformance with that very same standard, WCAG 2.1 AA. Now, the deadline was actually this past June 2025. And although there's exceptions and exclusions, basically it was saying that all organizations across Europe of a certain size, including educational institutions, had to conform by June 2025 to WCAG 2.1 AA. Now, in 2026, that's going to automatically become WCAG 2.2 AA. And I think I'll avoid going through the nerdy legal hoops of what gets us there. But essentially, Americans and Europeans and Canadians have been working together to develop these standards over the last 20 years, and they keep leapfrogging each other. So America went first on one thing, and then when Europe got around to putting out their things, say, well, we're going to use the more later version, and it keeps leapfrogging. So there's no question that 2.2 AA is coming to America sometime soon. And in Canada, we already have regulations that are being developed under our Accessible Canada Act, the ACA, which stands on the shoulders of the great work of the ADA. And the regulations, the deadlines, I'm not allowed to speak about them yet, but they undoubtedly be, over the next couple of years, that similarly federally regulated companies, etc., will need to conform to WCAG 2.1 or 2.2 AA by a certain date in one of the years to come. And so the reason I'm dwelling on it is mainly because Kelli asked me to, but also because many of our clients who are paddling hard to help make sure that they can still be the textbook provider to the University of Oshkosh or wherever are saying, well, we're also textbook providers to Europe and Australia and Korea and Canada, etc. And so while they're busily making sure that every title is 2.1 AA conforming, a lot of them are saying, yeah, well, we're here, we might as well conform to 2.2 AA. Because I should have buried the lead here. One of the wonderful things about how WCAG works is that WCAG 2.1 is a subset of 2.2, that everything that was true in WCAG 2.1 AA remains true in WCAG 2.2 AA. We just added a few more rules. So I said WCAG 2.1 AA had 50 rules. And so now 2.2 just has half a dozen more things you got to do. But you don't have to change all the previous stuff you did. And it's the same with 2.1 AA. It's got as a subset to it 2.0 AA. And so for anyone who had to conform to the US federal government's Section 508, which calls for WCAG 2.0 AA, going back to about 6 years ago, if your textbook already conformed to that, because you had to take care of schools that were receiving federal funding, you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to redo the work. You just take your 2.0 AA conformant things, and we went from 36 rules in 2.0 to 50 rules in 2.1. So you just have to make sure that they conform to these additional 14 things, many of which don't even occur in textbooks. So all this coming out of, if this whole thing sounds daunting and overwhelming, once we start dividing and conquering it, we discover often there's not that much to do except make sure that we have a clear expert opinion to vouch for the fact that, yep, our stuff meets or exceeds the current standards.
Yeah, and one thing to add is that often the reason why we come up with new versions of WCAG is because we're kind of addressing gaps. And sometimes it's because there's new technology, and sometimes it's because there are new areas. So for instance, low vision was a focus in 2.1, as was mobile accessibility, right? Because we didn't use mobile devices as much with 2.0 yet, right? So now everything relies on an app or being able to use something on a mobile device. And so similarly with new versions of WCAG, there's a big focus on cognitive accessibility, which also excites us quite a bit at CAST, because we're all about the learning brain, right? And we want to make sure that whatever we're creating really works well with the way people learn. So I'm really excited about that. And thank you for breaking that down, David. But again, as you emphasize, you are building on work that you've done before. If you are 2.0 conformant, then it's just a little extra jump to make it 2.1 conformant, and then another little extra jump to make it 2.2. So I love the leapfrogging idea, because guess who wins? We do, when people compete to be more accessible.
Oh, you're so right, Luis. Some of the biggest changes in 2.1 from 2.0 were all about mobile and touch. And, in 20 years ago, you wouldn't even dream of, let's say, a student with a mobility challenge and a powered wheelchair driving into class with a textbook on a tablet, which is connected, let's say, physically attached to their wheelchair. And the thing is, so for example, one of the things that was upgraded in WCAG was to make sure that if you rotated that tablet, that the display would still be legible, that you could still read that textbook and it would adapt. Now, a typical user would say, well, what's the big deal? I just take my tablet and I rotate it. I don't really care if the NY Times app is still the case, so you can only read it in one angle. fix that, New York Times. Okay, but if I have a tablet that's physically pinned down, attached to the arm of my chair, I don't have the mobility to be able to reach over and rotate it when I went from a book from one publisher to a book from another. That's game over. And so those are the kind of things where WCAG upped its game, and to make sure that we were keeping up with technology and what society's up to. Now, of course, back to without trade-offs, of course, every user prefers apps and documents that you can rotate your tablet and it magically reflows itself to the new shape. Or you split, I've got a folding phone and I fold it halfway and two apps appear, and look at that, the New York Times app's at the top and that document I was reading at the bottom, and it all works. And it works because of WCAG. It works because of harmonized international standards that are baked into the operating systems, because people know they're not going to be able to sell their stuff unless the platform is accessible.
Nothing like a final rule and a deadline. So, David, we've been thinking about the big picture, right? We talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act, the European Accessibility Act, and all of these things that really kind of set a foundation for us to work as a society, right? To reach a more accessible future. But sometimes it's the things that we do every day in our own small space, right, that has an impact. So we at CAS work a lot with K-12 educators, right? Teachers who are interacting directly with students in the classroom. Or we also work with faculty members and instructors in higher education. So for those groups, what's like one or two tips that you want to share with them that they can start working on tomorrow to make the world more accessible for their learners?
Oh, Luis, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I don't know an educator who isn't overwhelmed, who isn't overworked. And when you say to them, oh, and by the way, starting tomorrow, we do want to make sure that every class kit you make, did you make sure it's going to work for people with visual deficits? And did you make sure it doesn't rely on color? And all the things that are like, David, I love this. I want to be part of your movement, but I'm already overwhelmed. This sounds like it's going to take hours and hours and hours of extra work. And it's true whether you're a professor teaching master's students at UCSD, or whether I've got a group of 21 grade 3 students who are going to show up to your class tomorrow. So this is my big tip that we find works out really, really, really well. And it's about templates. And it's not something you'll get done in a day, but you're going to chip away at it until you'll never want to not use this tip again. And here's the key. If you give me a document that's not accessible, yeah, we can make it accessible, and it could take hours of work, and we may even have to rewrite it. We may have to do all kinds of things to it to turn it into either one version that's accessible for all, or we have an accessible alternative here and there and there. That's definitely extra work. However, if we create, in whatever organization we're in, a curated collection of templates for everything we do that already have accessibility baked in, then not only will you have a better user experience for every student, you'll get better learning outcomes right away because you've got this greatest hits template already going. But you continuously improve that. So imagine that if I have a teacher or an educator who's eager to make things accessible but doesn't have a lot of skills in that area, it's so much easier to teach them how not to break a template than it is to make a document accessible from scratch. So let's say we've got, a lesson plan, or that thing they give you on day one that tells you what you're going to learn.
The course outline.
Okay, so we had this one college, for example, who had this challenge of the course outlines. They all knew that, oh no, what if a student who needs accommodation shows up on day one and asks for me for my course outline in a different format? Well, we're going to have to promise that within 5 days, the accommodation desk will go to the trouble of hiring someone to make this. And meanwhile, for the first week of classes, this student doesn't have access to the information they needed. So we instead said, hey, you could pay us a stupid amount of money to make all these course outlines accessible, or we could create a system where all the course outlines follow the same template. And the course outline is already accessible by default. And there's components in there for every kind of thing that will go in a course outline. So not only did we convert this into an HTML interface where the educators just went to a window and created their course outline in the template and were done. And instead of, avoiding this task, they just got it done. But we made it so that every student had the URL of their course outline available to them on day 0. They could even study it before they showed up for class. It was instantly convertible into every major format. Let's say it's Braille printing, read out loud, whatever, a Daisy reader. But also, this school used to hire 2 people full-time to herd hundreds and hundreds of professors to get their course outlines done on time. They were able to reduce that to a half a person year. So not only did all students get better course outlines, not only did all educators spend less time preparing for class, but the school saved a year and a half, 1.5 person years on a task that was no fun for anyone.
Absolutely.
Now, I know you can't create templates overnight, but if you buy into being an educator who is part of a philosophy, that if you are given a template and you say, well, this template doesn't work for me, there's no place for a bar graph. I say you go back to the curator of that template and you say, hey, can we improve the template so that I can now easily have a bar graph that doesn't rely on color in order to communicate? And now, not only have you made it better for you, but you've made it better for 400 other people using that same template next year who also were struggling to get accessible bar graphs. So, tip for educators, accessible templates.
That could be $1 million tip.
Agree.
And it's something we can vouch for it because working with David, we've actually instituted that at CAS. We improved
we did work on the template. That's right.
We definitely made modifications to our template, and it does save you a lot of time when you have a template that's accessible. So absolutely, that's like literally $1 million tip. It could save you $1 million over time. So take that tip on. So,
but the check is not in the mail, David. The check is not in the mail. I don't know about you, Luis, but I feel like this has been such a valuable conversation just within this short time. And I feel like every time we talk about accessibility, it's just remembering that it's not about meeting some checklist. It really is about changing the way we think about design and inclusion in general. And so for our listeners, remember what David and Luis said. Accessibility is something that you can start working on today. It could be overwhelming, but you can start today. And a big one that I'm going to take away with, I'm going to make Luis and I shirts that WCAG is cool. WCAG is cool. So, David, before we go, could you just let our listeners know where they can find your work and follow you? Where can they follow you? We'll put all the information in the show notes.
For sure. They should simply come to our WCAG2.com website, WCAG digit 2.com. And we've got all kinds of great resources there. Like we have I did a keynote on Global Accessibility Awareness Day, but nothing but Title II for higher education, stuff like that. Or we've also got, Luis, remember we worked together on that guide for how to put on accessible online meetings that CAST helped us do. So we've got that there. We've got a whole library of accessibility, disability, lots of stuff there. WCAG2.com, I think, is the place to go. Mm-hmm. And because Kelli, if we wanted to sum it all up, I think it's basically this. If we design for the extremes and we do it well, everyone benefits.
Love it.
That's a great point to end on. And
I agree.
David, always such a pleasure. We gain so much from these conversations with you, and we've loved working with you. Really value your approach to design. You started as a graphic designer, so design is at the core of what you do. It's also at the core of what we do at CAS, right? We design learning experiences that work for everybody. So it's a great partnership, and we've really appreciated having you on the podcast.
I second that. Thank you so much, David.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Learning Experience Podcast. We are so glad you're a part of this conversation.
And if you're like me and today's episode sparked some ideas or got your brain flowing, well, just remember there's so much more to explore out there.
And remember that CAST is leading the way when it comes to accessibility, workforce innovation, professional development, and research.
So visit cast.org to dive deeper. That's CAST.org, and keep learning with us.